Welcome, everybody. My name is Tom Peaco, and I'm the president and CEO for the Penobscot Bay Regional Chamber of Commerce. We want to welcome you all to this Zoom meeting, and I know we extended the invitation to our other chambers around the state to invite folks too. So we may have some folks from around the state here, but we're thrilled to have you all, and this is one in a number of opportunities that we're trying to make available to chamber members to get some answers to all of the resources that are available and how to navigate all of that with the current coronavirus pandemic. So a couple of quick thank yous I wanted to make, and first of all, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't start with an acknowledgement of the the horrific explosion at the Androscoggin Mill in Jay today, and we're all wrestling with the effects of the coronavirus, but certainly our hearts go out to everybody in Jay who's wrestling with that, and we certainly hope that we get good news about safety there for everybody involved. So, as I said, I have a couple of quick thank yous before we get going. I want to thank Chris Rector from Senator King's team and all of the Senator's team for helping to pull this together. Chris was a huge help to us in making this happen. So thank you, Chris, and to the rest of Senator King's staff for pulling it together, as well as to Kate and the folks at the Maine DECD for getting Commissioner Johnson involved with this today too. So thank you both for that. I do want to thank the Maine State Chamber for making their Zoom account available to us and managing the call for us today. So that's great. Thank you to Angie Arno and everybody at the Maine State Chamber for your help. And I want to thank Eaton Peabody for sponsoring today's event. Eaton Peabody attorneys are great supporters of our chamber, and I know they are for many around the state. So thank you for your support today and helping us to bring this session to everyone. So finally, I just wanted to acknowledge that we are recording the session today, and we are going to make this available publicly on our website after. So for those who are not able to join us live, they can see it, as well as to the media. So just be aware of that as we proceed through the hour together. I'd love now to just turn it over to Senator King and Commissioner Johnson for some opening remarks before we get into questions. So Senator King, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate this opportunity and just the chance to chat, and I want to do a fair amount of listening today. I hope the folks that are on the conference will share with me how the implementation is going of the CARES Act. One of my mottos of life is that execution is as important as vision, and we can pass a good bill, but how it's executed is very important. So I want to hear about that. Just to put this in perspective, I was just on a conference with several former federal officials in 2009, which was the largest year that the SBA ever provided loan guarantees. They did $30 billion worth of loans in that whole year. And under the PPP, SBA has committed something like $240 billion in the last week. So the work that's been done, the actions of the various federal agencies, I want to thank them for really jumping on this and trying their best to cope with a lot of huge changes and a lot of big numbers over the last week or two. As you know, the bill that the Senate and the Congress passed about 2 weeks ago, called the CARES Act, had a number of provisions. The PPP, the Paycheck Protection Act, protection program, was certainly one of them, one of the most important, that provides support to small businesses to keep people on the payroll, allow them to pay their rent, their mortgage, their utilities, and essentially stay in business during the period that program's in effect, which is 2 months. There was also a large package of assistance to big businesses that is being run by the Department of the Treasury. And then, of course, individuals, the checks that will be going out are actually the electronic deposits that'll be going out in the next few days to people. Anybody who filed a tax return over the last couple of years, Social Security recipients, people on disability should be getting in most cases, electronic deposits. If you filed and got a check, it will take you longer, but the checks will be also forthcoming. Unemployment insurance is a big part of this, bumping up the value of unemployment by $600. That's a 4-month long program, goes till about the 1st of July. That will also we expanded eligibility to people who were self-employed, who were gig workers, part-time workers, in order to get as much support into the economy as possible. A lot of money has gone to the hospitals. I was on the phone with some representatives of a rural Maine hospital last week. The morning that I talked to them, they'd just gotten a check for $600,000, which is going to allow them literally to stay open for a while longer. So, and there should be more coming, a big appropriation for hospitals and other medical care providers. And that's a big part. One of the parts that is not working as well is aid to states. There was a provision, or is a provision in the law, for direct aids to states, but the way it's drafted, it only applies to state expenditures as a result of the coronavirus, not loss of revenues. And in most states, and I suspect this is true in Maine, by far the lion's share of the hit to the state budget will be revenues because of sales taxes and income taxes that are going to be lost. We've moved the tax day, as you know, from today until July 15th. And the bill doesn't help with that problem. That's a huge problem that I think has to be fixed. Otherwise, the states that, who can't print money like we can in Washington are going to have to either do tax increases, which wouldn't make sense in the middle of this economic crisis as well as a healthcare crisis, or they're going to have to start laying a whole lot of people off, which also doesn't make sense, particularly at a time of heightened demand for state services. So that's one of the pieces that we have to fix. So I'm hearing good things from around Maine, not uniformly, but by and large, the PPP seems to be working. There have been a lot of businesses that have applied, have been approved, and that's going forward. Unemployment insurance, Heather Johnson is with us from the state. Perhaps she can update us on that. That's a massive undertaking for the computer systems and the systems that they have to adjust the unemployment system to the number one, the overwhelming number of people that have applied in the last couple of weeks, and the changes to the program. So, and I guess finally, as you know, the president last night essentially delegated to the governors the decision about when we reopen. And as a former governor, I can tell you this is a really hard decision, because all of you that are watching know the economic impact and how dramatic it's been. And I know it, when I walk down Main Street in Brunswick and see closed store after closed store, it's unthinkable in terms of what the impact is. But the problem is that we have no vaccine and we have no cure for this virus. And the only way to control its spread is for us to stay away from one another, to stay home and to not congregate, whether it's in a restaurant or in a workplace, unless it's an essential workplace. And so that's the dilemma. And Governor Mills is going to be dealing with this. I know she's consulting with governors in Vermont and New Hampshire to talk about how to do this, how to do it carefully, because the great danger that I see, Jim, is that we say, okay, we're around the corner, the number of cases has plateaued, we feel like we're in a pretty good place, and we start to back off, and then we see a renewed spike in the spread of the virus, which would only take us back to square one. So that's what I know Governor Mills and others are wrestling with. That's going to be a tough decision. And I think the trick is, number one, we need testing. We don't have adequate test facilities. That's got to be part of the reopening strategy. And that's where I don't think the federal government has really held up its end of the bargain. but we're going to try to get those things worked out. And I'll be working with Governor Mills. I'm in almost daily contact with her now. In fact, it is daily now that I think about it. And we're going to try to work through these things. But in the meantime, the business community has to tell us what's working, what's not working, where the holdups are, and we'll try to fix them.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate that. I want to give Commissioner Johnson, Heather Johnson from the Maine Department of Economic and Community Development, an opportunity to make some opening remarks too. Commissioner, it's amazing. It was actually 7 weeks ago today that we were together at the Samoset Resort when you spoke at our business breakfast there, and none of us knew really the magnitude of what was coming our way. So we're thrilled to see you again. We obviously wish it was under different circumstances, but we appreciate you being with us today. So. Whoops, I guess. I think there we go.
Thank you, Tom. One of the interesting things about Zoom is people can control whether or not you are muted. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for making the time. I know there is a lot for everybody right now to try to work through and manage. Certainly our thoughts are with the folks in J as we try to help them and understand that situation. We'll balance this discussion because we thought this was an incredibly important one as well. So I think the senator did a great job outlining some of the what's next, right? As we go through these stages, stage one was really trying to understand what restrictions did we need to put in place to try to improve public health, right? As public health is the #1 priority, what do we have to do to flatten that curve? I think a term we've all heard a lot over the last few weeks. And so that was step one. And I think we've done a lot of that work. We continue to watch the healthcare numbers and be really focused on that. I think this next phase that we're working on is what are those decision points and milestones that we get to that allow us to confidently start to slowly release some of the restrictions so that we can go back to more of our normal business life. When do those happen? How do they happen? What is the path for that? I will say it's significantly early to really be having that discussion, but I know that's what's on everybody's mind is the what's next and when can we move through this. So I would say we are working with the Boston Fed and a number of other economists to continue to look at that, but obviously public health is the #1 priority, and so testing and healthcare outcomes will continue to be the key factors as we work through this. So with that, Tom, I think we've seen Q&A be the most helpful in these discussions because everybody has their own questions and it might be helpful to get to that.
Absolutely, thank you. I do want to just preface this with we've had a number of questions submitted in advance, so I'm going to work my way through some of those, and I see people that are posting questions in the chat as well, so we'll do our best to get to those. Clearly, we're not going to get to every single question before us, but we'll do our best to record all of these and try to loop back with the answers as we're able to do that. So, Commissioner, just playing off what you were saying, we did have a number of questions along those lines about how do we open up again when the time is right, and what kinds of triggers are we looking for to know that it will be time to do that? What milestones are we looking for and working toward and what interim steps are going to be taken? So we've had a number of questions along those lines, and I'd welcome either of your thoughts on that to the best of your ability at this point, knowing it's still fairly early. Senator, do you want to start on that one?
Well, as I mentioned, I think that's the question that's on everybody's mind, and the danger is moving too fast and then having a relapse. And I think, but I do think before we really get to that question, we have to have the infrastructure in place that will underlie any kind of reopening. And from all of my reading and discussions, the key is testing. The ability to determine quickly who's carrying the disease. Can they be isolated? Who have they been in contact with? If we don't have that, then reopening is a kind of crapshoot where you have the virus continuing to bounce around the society. I mean, I was on a conference call yesterday in Illinois. There was a funeral. One person went who was infected, and within 2 weeks, 16 people were infected and 3 died. So it is really a powerful, dangerous disease. So the testing, and I was a little concerned last night watching the president when he said, well, it's all up to the governors, including the testing. And I don't think the governors are in a position to have control of that, because the testing materials are a national resource. And in fact, a lot of governors are having trouble getting a hold of those resources. And I've been on conference calls with FEMA and others, and I'll tell you, it's a little hard to determine what exactly the system is for distributing those kind of resources. But I think as Heather said, the first question has to be health, and testing is the key to that. Until we have that down, I'm afraid if we act prematurely, we're just going to be right back in the fix that we were a week or two ago. And it could be even worse, because remember, we've now got, I think, 600,000 cases in the United States. It started with 1 case. And, those of you that took math, and I don't remember much of my high school math, but when you have a logarithmic increase in something, it really, the track goes up very fast. And let's say it plateaus, even starts to go down, but as long as we've still got cases out there, the risk of spread is still there. So I think the other good news is we have what I think is one of the most outstanding CDC directors in the country, Dr. Shah, who has really been enormously helpful, I know, to the governor and to the people of the state in terms of articulating what's going on here. So I think the governor will be consulting, I know, with business people, but also with Dr. Shah and healthcare people around the state.
Thank you. Heather, do you have anything to add on that? No. Okay.
Oh, now I can. Thanks for unmuting me. No, I think the senator's right. The only reason I brought it up, I think we are way too early, but it is probably the #1 question I've gotten over the last 4 or 5 days, right? That's the question everybody wants answered. And so I just want to give people confidence that work is ongoing. Dr. Shaw, Commissioner Lambrew, a number of others are very involved in it as well, to help us walk that fine line between public health and the economy, and how do we create the best environment we can.
Great, thank you. The next question we received was from Matthew Levin from the Bayview Collection Hotels in Camden, but I've heard this a number of times from other members of our chamber, and that's around the timing of the Paycheck Protection Program and the dilemma, being in order for the loan to be forgiven, you have to rehire most, or if not all, of your staff that have been forced to be laid off. And of course, with the executive order from the governor, most lodging properties are closed now in restaurants and others. Do either of you have any thoughts or updates to share about this timing issue of bringing people back, but also it's really not, businesses aren't open in order to bring people back right now to have meaningful employment. So,
Heather, you want to start on that one?
I can. I do think that that's a real challenge for business. The intent of the program, right, is to keep people employed and employ them through this time where the operating value wouldn't make that equation happen. For some businesses, that isn't going to give them the full benefit of the program. And for some businesses, that means they're going to have to potentially, not all of their loan will be forgivable. And so, I think there are certainly some challenges, right? As you put together a program of that magnitude in 7 days, I think it was about 7 days, that, I think we'll see some of these challenges as it relates to seasonality. I think some of them are captured, by allowing businesses to select certain periods of time in which their payroll was captured for. But the going forward piece, I do think for some businesses will continue to be a challenge.
Great, Senator.
I wasn't involved in the direct negotiations on this particular program, so I can't really comment on what people were thinking, but I don't think they were thinking about businesses whose employees aren't necessary at the time. The whole idea was, we want you to keep your employees on board. But if you've got a hospitality in a business, a hotel or a restaurant, under the law, in order to get the forgivable loan, you'd have to bring back people to do nothing because there isn't any business for them to do. So I think that's something that we're going to have to look at there. As you know, there are some discussions. I don't know whether they're going to call it COVID 3.5 or COVID 4, but there are discussions. In fact, I just heard an hour ago they're beginning this afternoon in Washington with Secretary Mnuchin and Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, I suspect the leadership of the House, to talk about these issues. And I think this is one that I don't think was fully contemplated when the program was designed, but it's one that I've heard about from Maine businesses where it doesn't make, if they don't bring their people back, they can still get the loan for their utilities and mortgage and sort of keep the doors open, but it's not forgivable. It becomes a debt that has to be repaid. It's only forgivable if they have keep the people on their payroll, but then you have this anomaly of companies that don't need people right now.
Great. Thank you. I have a question in the chat that I'll read from our State Representative Vicky Dudera, who covers the Camden, Rockport, and Islesboro communities. So her question is really on behalf of our windjammers and day sailors here in the Mid-Coast, and if we have any inkling about what our harbor traffic might look like this summer, and will we be able to travel to other ports with our schooners and be able to take passengers? Is there any inkling about what that might look like this summer? That's a pretty important part of our tourism economy here in the Mid-Coast.
Well, of course, it's all of Maine is asking that question because tourism, particularly in the summer, is such an important part of our whole economy, particularly along the coast. So if I gave you a prediction now, that's like predicting the weather a month from now. I think it's going to be, I think we need to be realistic that this isn't going to be over in a month. It may start to slack off in the early summer. Whether people will be traveling, what their expectations will be, I just think is impossible to say at this time. And it underlines what I said. It really strikes me that we need to be sure we have this thing under control before we open up and create the possibility of it coming back and getting even worse, because then what we've really done is prolong the pain. And that's a call that's going to have to be made. But I understand the question, and I get it a lot from people in the Mid-Coast area where I am. But I just think it's impossible. But the nearest I can tell from the science is that they don't expect this to really be fully controlled for months and months. And it won't be fully controlled until we have a vaccine, and that's sometime next year. So I think what we're going to see, and Heather can comment on this, is some kind of partial opening based upon particular businesses, particular areas. How can they be made safe? What kind of protective gear might be necessary? Fewer tables in a restaurant, for example. But I just think, to predict where we're going to be on the coast of Maine in June and July is practically impossible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Commissioner.
Yeah, I agree, Senator. The CDC just extended the kind of no sail for large cruise ships, but it doesn't get down into the schooner discussion. So that's one that we're having locally because that tends to fall more to the states. So I think more to come there. That piece of work hasn't really been covered by any of the orders as they exist today, just because it's a summer activity. It's much more of a summer activity, and so I think, as more information comes in, we will continue to kind of give the guidance that we feel confident in.
Great, thank you. The next question I've had from a couple of people that's probably more directed for Senator King, because I think it's a federal issue, is, but you know, folks have started to get, even today, their $1,200 into their checking accounts for part of the stimulus for individuals and $500 for students. But there is this gap of young people who are over age 17 but have not, you know, that are in college or haven't fully launched into the world yet maybe, and are still claimed on their parents' taxes in that, you know, late teen, early 20 time frame, where the stimulus is not coming for them. So do you have any insights on that? Is that something that may be changing down the road, or what's the status of that?
Well, I think that's on the list of things for people to look at. I mean, the whole idea was to get this money out fast to as many people as possible, and to help people, you know, with buying fuel and food and just coping in the short run, and to get it out as soon as possible. So I think that's a potential fix. I don't think it was a deliberate decision. But the idea was to focus on families with younger children, and that's why it's $1,200 per adult and $500 for a child in the house. That's on my list for COVID 3.5, which we're starting to discuss right now by endless conference calls, I can assure you.
Right. Thank you. Question in the chat from Kate McAleer from Bixby here in Rockland. Why was June 30th configured as the due date for the PPP to be issued as a grant when we may not be back up and running by June 30th? I think we've kind of already touched on some of that. But was there some magic in June 30th, or just a hope at the time that that would be when we'd be back?
I don't think there was any magic in the date. I think it was a aspirational date that 2 months of the program would be sufficient to sort of get us over the hump. I think it's important to point out that the bill that we passed, people call it a stimulus bill. I call it a keep the doors open bill. It's huge, over $2 trillion. That's 10% of our GDP, and it's going out in a matter of weeks. And the idea was simply to sort of keep people afloat. Unemployment insurance, grants to the hospitals, to the states, all of which were designed to sort of get us through to the next phase. There's no doubt that there's going to have to be a follow-up to this. There will probably be at least 2. There may even be more than that, depending upon how the virus goes and how the economy is affected. So I don't think there was anything magic about June 30th. It was just chosen. The extended unemployment rate goes through the end of July. That was 4 months from the time the bill passed. And but even that may prove to be inadequate. You have to remember, we were building the airplane while we were flying it. I mean, this was an extraordinarily high level of emergency. And I should mention, the bill that we finally passed the Senate unanimously. And that practically never happens. When you get Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders both voting for the same bill, that's a bit of a positive. I think that people should realize that the Congress could in fact come together with the administration in an emergency to do something big and important. It may not be perfect, and nobody argues that it is, but I think it's the first time I've seen that happen since I've been down there.
That's great. Thank you. Next question from the chat from Julie Eaton. Question concerns the aid to self-employed lobstermen and women, and as well as other harvesters along the coast. And says she's grateful that it was added to the bill, but it's confusing on how to apply and what we qualify for. Can you provide some more information or clarity around on that, and when they can apply? Either of you have information on that?
Heather, you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, as of now, so people that are self-employed and sole proprietors can apply through their lending partner for the PPP program. And so that is ready. They can also apply for the emergency loan program, which has a grant portion to it as well. So those programs are now open for that community. I do think the question about it being confusing, I think you're right. There are lots of resources out there right now, to the senator's point. I think people are trying to stand up programs as quickly as possible to help businesses and individuals bridge their way through this challenging time. And so as we do that, kind of this collection of resources can be overwhelming at times as well. So a couple of things to keep in mind. We do have a full resource sheet on our site that collects all of the programs onto one sheet. So hopefully that can be helpful to people. The other thing is all of the SBA programs, the loan programs, the payroll protection programs, and the grant program all run through local lending partners. So if you go into whatever local lending institution you use, they are a great resource. Additionally, Chambers of Commerce, the Maine Small Business Center, CEI Center as well, all have kind of resources and people available to help navigate these resources and figure out which one is the most effective, or which ones collectively are the most effective for your individual business.
One of the issues that's emerged is that a lot of small businesses and sort of sole proprietorships don't have ongoing credit relationships with banks. And the banks who are administering the PPP program are basically saying, well, we're going to start with our customers, with the people that we already know, that we've already loaned money to. I just learned a half hour ago that PayPal, Square, and Intuit, who have financial relationships with a lot of businesses that aren't necessarily have a banking relationship, have been approved just over the last couple of days to also administer and distribute funds under this program. So that's one of the little wrinkles that seems to be worked out. But we are concerned about businesses that don't have a credit history with the bank. Although it's a forgivable loan, but it's really like a grant, and the banks are not at risk financially. So it should be people, as long as they can have some knowledge of who they're dealing with, it should work through our banks. And I think the banks in Maine have done a good job from a standing start with a brand new program over the last 2 weeks.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, just we got a couple of data points. I mean, we actually ranked third in the region, in the Northeast region. And so we were behind Massachusetts and Connecticut, but outdistanced the other 3 states by quite a bit. So we had 98 lending institutions in Maine that have already taken advantage and have approval for their businesses for the PPP program, which is, I mean, that's significant compared to what we normally put out through that type of a program.
Right.
Great, thank you. Senator, another question we had, as you're well aware, we have a number of tourism-related businesses that depend on the J1 and H2B visa workers seasonally. And do you have any update on that yet, about what the status is of that program for this year?
I do. I have bad news, good news, and bad news. The bad news was that we have an inadequate number of H2Bs initially allowed by the administration last winter. The good news is that a group of us, myself and principally Tom Tillis, a Republican senator from North Carolina, and a lot of others, really hammered, working with Susan Collins on the Appropriation Committee, hammered on getting that number increased. And lo and behold, in late February, early March, the administration added 35,000 H2Bs. Then this thing hit, and 2 weeks later, they basically said, we're not going to finalize that, and in a sense, forget about the extra 35,000 because so many people are now unemployed. We don't really need them. So the bad news is now we're no better off than we were back in January. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's going to be a valid come tourist season. It's just, as I said before, it's so hard to predict what it's going to look like this year. But that's the update on the H-2Bs. They weren't there, and then they were there, and now they're unfortunately not there again.
Right. Okay. Thank you. We had another question related to landlords. Has there been any discussion of support for landlords? Many businesses are struggling to be able to afford to pay rent, especially when you can't even be open. But many building owners can't just afford to forgive the rent either, as they're relying on that income to pay their bills. And the question relates to, is there any financial support for landlords during this time? So.
Well, I think the first thought is that under the PPP program, which is the Paycheck Protection Act, rent is an allowable and reimbursable expense. In other words, if you're qualified for the program, you get a loan that turns into a grant at the end of the period that's supposed to cover your payroll and rent and utilities and mortgage, I believe, and some other expenses. So that should allow businesses, if they take advantage of that program, to keep paying their rent in this situation. A question which I don't know the answer to is whether a landlord is a PPP eligible business, where you're losing your revenues, and whether you're I would think that it would be. Heather may know the answer to this, but if you're an LLC or a business whose job it is to own properties, and your revenues are based on rents, you should be able to get some help with the PPP, but it wouldn't necessarily cover your lost revenues. It will cover your expenses ongoing, but not necessarily the lost revenues.
That's right, Senator. I agree with you. I think depending on their business structure and how they've structured that real estate holding, they would be eligible for PPP. They would also likely be eligible for the the emergency loan, which has a tier that has a grant portion to it as well. Certainly, I think we are all trying to figure out this balance of kind of rent, mortgage payments versus kind of building owners needing that flow coming in as well. And how do you try to keep that stable through this period is a key challenge. But those are two programs that potentially can help. Our understanding and talking to the lending institutions is they are certainly looking at solutions to try to be helpful as well. Payment deferrals, things like that, debt restructuring that can help us get through kind of this period of time as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can tell you from having served on a bank board in a former life that banks hate foreclosures. They don't like going through that process, and I think we're going to see our banks being very reasonable through this period because of the unprecedented nature of where we are.
Great. Thank you. The next question is related to tourism promotion. I know, Heather, the Maine Office of Tourism falls under your purview, of course, and Senator, we welcome your thoughts on this too. But have you had a chance yet to give any thought or discussion with the Maine Office of Tourism about ideas about how do we share the word with the world that Maine is reopened for business when the time comes, and that there's a fair amount of insecurity in the tourism industry that when it's safe to be open, we won't be ready to deliver the message that we're open. So, there's a lot on the plate right now, but also looking ahead to how do we tell the world that we're ready for visitors when the time comes.
Yeah, so I think this is the balance that the Senator was talking about earlier, right? It's probably not a switch that just flips on or off, right? That my guess is it's a much more gradual, dimmer switch, right? That things slowly kind of turn back on as they can do so in a safe way. And so yes, absolutely, we are looking at what those steps are and how we communicate those steps for people when there are things we can do. To the example of, well, can we open up restaurants and take out half of the tables or some of the tables? Is that step one? And then we can tell people that. Absolutely, there's a lens of marketing that would go with any of those decisions, and the team is kind of queued up and ready for that. I do think that's kind of the question, though, is will we be ready when the time comes? And then that time won't sneak up on us, right? We certainly, nobody anticipated this global pandemic. And so, yes, we pretty quickly had to make some actions and take some decisions that were made in a much more quick fashion, right? So there wasn't a lot of involvement. When we go the other way, right, you can be more planful, but what are those milestones? How do you know, right, where are those triggers? And then how do you prepare for them? And that work is going on now.
Great.
I have an idea for the ad campaign.
Great.
You start with this crowded apartment and it says, tired of your four walls? Come see ours. And you have an aerial view of Mount Katahdin or Camden Harbor. I mean, you know, people are going to want to get out. Once this is this opportunity, I think Maine, I think once things start to open up, people, Americans are going to want to travel. They're going to want to take a deep breath. And a place like Maine is absolutely the natural place to try to come. So I'm hoping that we're going to be able to open sufficiently by the summer to be running a campaign like that.
Great.
I love it though.
For both of you, we've had a question about, or a couple of questions about support for nonprofit organizations. Of course, you know, many social service organizations like food banks and other places, many others are feeling additional strain right now. And obviously with the SBA loans and, you know, the PPP program are available, the 501c3s, which is great. But, you know, are there other things coming down the pike that might lend some support to keep our nonprofit organizations on the front lines of social service, you know, afloat as they work with overwhelming demand, particularly around, you know, food insecurity and those kinds of things?
Well, I can tell you that getting nonprofits into the PPP program was a high priority for a lot of people, and it was a subject of some pretty serious negotiations. So getting those nonprofits, those 501c3s, of which we have a great deal in Maine, they're covered under the PPP program for their payroll, for their mortgage, for their utility costs, and that should be a huge help. As you know, C6s, which the local chambers were not covered. There was a concern about federal funds going to organizations which lobby. And hopefully that's going to be something we can address in the next round. But it was a significant addition to the bill, I think, to be sure that nonprofits were covered and were eligible just the same as ordinary businesses.
One of the other things that we've seen with the nonprofits, we have about 98,000 people in Maine that work in nonprofits. And one of the things we've seen is the senator mentioned earlier, that some small businesses don't have relationships with lending institutions. Some of the nonprofits, I think, didn't necessarily fall into that category, but fell into the timing category of, right, it was a first come, first serve program. And so you had to get through that window pretty quickly. And that was a little bit more challenging, I think, for some of the nonprofits. So we're talking to the Boston Fed and some others about, as other programs ramp up, could there be a TA period that we could help kind of with some support from some of these local resources to support nonprofits maybe and sole proprietors in a way that maybe we weren't able to do in this round. So I think some of that's on people's radar, and we certainly want to be more supportive of them as we go forward.
Heather, let me ask you a question related to one that we had earlier about people like lobstermen and sole proprietors along the coast. Would they not also be allowed be eligible for the expanded unemployment insurance benefits, which is now close to $1,000 a week, under the terms of that bill? Is that an option other than the PPP?
They would be, depending on their business structure, but most of them absolutely would be eligible for that. That program right now, they are still putting the final touches on in Maine. So we haven't actually opened that up yet. We're trying to figure out a couple of pieces, including how do you verify financials? How do you verify kind of whatever earnings or payroll equivalent that those owners would be taking out to put them into the unemployment process? So we've got a couple of things there to still work out, but I would expect fairly shortly we will be able to be taking those folks into the system as well.
Great.
Tom? We can't hear you, Tom.
Am I back?
Yep.
There you go.
Okay, good. Had a couple of questions from, again, tourism related, being here on the coast, but, we have many small inns, B&Bs, boat captains, businesses like that who derive the vast majority of their income in a pretty short amount of time during the year, 4 or 5 months. And so I think the concern is that maybe they might not qualify for as much support as they might if their income was more spread over a 12-month period. Has there any been thought given to that about for people who pack a lot of their income into a 4 or 5 month window, we're getting closer to a place where it looks like that 4 or 5 month window is going to be impacted. So are there things in the works?
As of now, as of now, the PPP program terminates at the end of June. And I think one of the things we're going to have to look at when we get back is extending that, because that's right in the middle of our season, and it's right in the middle of the time when many of those businesses you mentioned are going to have the maximum impact. So extending that is going to be, I think, one of the things that's on the agenda. We haven't talked about who's paying for all this, and I was asked a question in a session a week or so ago, who's paying for it, and the answer is our kids and our grandchildren, because all this money is being borrowed. Normally, I'm pretty uncomfortable with that. Two things have, sort of convinced me that this is what we have to do. One is the urgency of the situation. If we didn't do these kinds of programs to protect the economy, the economic impact of going into a full-blown depression, which I think would be at least possible, if not likely, would be enormous and probably worse than the cost of the programs. And the second is that interest rates, what we're paying on our federal borrowing, is about as low as it's ever been. So if there was a time to do this, now's the time. Unfortunately, we should have been saving for this situation over the past 5 or 6 years as we went into a positive economic territory, but instead we only added to the deficit, which essentially sopped up some of the borrowing capacity that now we need in this emergency. But don't get me started on that long discussion. But I think we're going to have to expand some of these programs, and the one that expires on June 30th that is primarily designed for small businesses, I think is one that's going to have to be extended.
Okay. All right. Senator, this one is more directed on a federal level. As the world is focused on COVID-19, can you assure us that there's a dedicated portion of the U.S. government that is keeping an eye on everything else that we're supposed to be keeping an eye on, like national security, foreign affairs, and as Polly writes, what the Taliban is doing? So, we want to make sure that those things are, we're not getting too far afield from focusing on other important aspects of our federal government.
Well, I can assure you that that's the case. I serve on the Armed Services Committee, and in fact, in 2 hours, we're having a conference call with the Pentagon, with the officials in the Defense Department, focused principally on COVID-19, but also on other issues. I've also spent the last year on cybersecurity. I just had a call this morning with the staff of the Armed Services Committee about recommendations of the commission that I was on for dealing with cybersecurity. Yeah, I mean, this is a dangerous time. I mean, it's a excuse me, somebody's calling me. This is a dangerous time, and we can't take our eye off national security and what's going on in the Middle East or in Afghanistan or in the oil markets. That's one of the reasons that we're trying to pay attention to all of those kinds of issues. So I think the short answer is yes, although it would be unrealistic to say that a lot of the attention of the federal government isn't focused right now on this crisis. But I get briefings every week on defense and intelligence matters, and I can tell you that we're keeping our eyes and ears open.
Great, thank you. We had a couple of questions related to utilities, and I think there's been some accommodation for making sure that, you know, for example, businesses don't get their electricity shut off. But is there any anything coming that might help with utility rates for businesses that are, you know, obviously not bringing in much in the way of revenue?
So, Senator, do you want me to take this one, or?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So, you know, the PUC is continuing to look at how do you source power at lower rates. You know, that is an ongoing part of this. And I think, you know, as we think about the restart, I think people are affectionately calling the restart of the economy, you know, there are some places, right, that we may put an extra look on. And if you think about the impact that renewable energy can have on all of our businesses and reducing kind of reliance and reducing costs across the board for businesses, and are there infrastructural pieces like that we can put into place as we go forward, that there's certainly a lot to be done there. As far as short-term utility payments, there aren't any programs, but there are there's new guidance around kind of what the rules are about, you know, shutting off power and things like that will protect people in the short term.
Well, I also think, Heather, that the PPP covers utility payments. That's one of the permissible uses.
Yeah, up to 25% of the loan can be that.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Senator, I'm seeing a few questions in the chat related to elections in November and how do we assure that they're safe and that they can continue to be held. Have you had any discussions about any of that?
Well, there's a lot of discussion going on in Washington right now. In fact, we're trying to figure out how we can vote remotely and safely so that the members of Congress don't have to go back and congregate the same way they did in 1870. Unfortunately, Leader McConnell is not very receptive to that. But the really important issue is the one you identify, which is elections in November. We don't want to see a repeat of what happened in Wisconsin, and there's no reason that would have to be the case given the lead time. I think what we should do, one of my mottos is prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And I think we should be prepared for the possibility of still having social distancing rules in place in November, and therefore expand the ability of people to vote remotely. In Maine, we have a pretty good early voting system. You can go to your town office one person at a time and cast your ballot. You don't have to have, you know, an excuse for why you're not going to be there on election day. There are states, Oregon is one of them. I think there's several others that have had voting by mail for years. They don't seem to have a fraud problem. And I think that's really the direction we should be going in. We should be making it easy for people to vote. And I am concerned about November, and I'm afraid that may become a partisan issue over the next couple of months. But I know that there are a lot of people talking about it, and it's one that if we wait until September to try to do something, shame on us. The other reality is that voting is by and large up to the states. The system that we have in Maine is unique to Maine. Oregon is different, New York is different, Vermont is different. And so the states have a great deal of control over how this happens. In the bill that we just passed was $400 million to assist the states in getting ready for the next election, but I don't think that's really adequate. And, you know, without going into great detail, there's cyber problems. We've got states that still have voting systems that are hooked onto the internet, which is a disaster. So there's a whole level of problems, but it really is something that the states are going to have to wrestle with over the next 6 months.
Okay. Have there anything to add on that one?
No, I think, you know, the governor issued an executive order, I think it was last week, pushing primaries back. And to the senator's point, I don't think it's something we're going to wait on. I think it's outside of my purview, but my understanding is the Secretary of State and the governor's office and a number of others are thinking about what are the safe and most effective ways to be inclusive in an election.
Great. So we're I'm going to do one more question, and then if that's okay with you, and then we'll wrap it up. And that relates to PPE, not to be confused with PPP, but the question was related to who determines what states, and I think within the state too, and how much of PPEs are distributed, both to states and then within the state where they go. And is that a fair and equitable process, and how do we ensure that we, are able to get sort of our piece of the pie of what's available? So
that's a question that I've been trying to get the answer to for 2 weeks or longer and haven't been able to get a satisfactory answer. I specifically was on a conference call with the leadership of FEMA last week and said, how do you distribute the materials that are coming into your control? And they said, well, the first 50% goes to hotspots. And I said, well, what about the other 50%? And I couldn't really get an answer to that. It sounded like, well, they're going back into the private distribution channels. And that's one of the problems, because we have the states bidding against one another, paying sometimes 10 times what they paid a year ago for this kind of equipment. I think that's been one of the places where the federal government has really let us down in terms of organizing that system and centralizing it in a way that makes sense, and having some accountability and transparency so that we know what it is that how that's being actually administered. So I'm still chasing that answer and going to continue to, but I think, and that goes to one of the, I'll wind up with this. One of the things about this huge CARES Act that we've been talking about for an hour is accountability and transparency. And we really pushed hard to get more transparency into the bill. Unfortunately, the day the president signed it, he took out one of the major provisions with his signature. He issued a thing called a signing statement saying, I'm not going to allow the Inspector General on this program to share what they learned with Congress. And then a few days later, he fired the Inspector General at the Defense Department, or moved him aside, who was going to be the chair of the group that was going to oversee this. So that's something that's really of concern to me. This is a massive amount of money. It's the taxpayers' money. We ought to know exactly where it's all going, how and why. And so far, I've not been satisfied with the way that part of the process has worked.
Okay, thank you.
So Tom, can I just add to that? Because so one of the things that we've found is we don't, to the senator's point, we don't necessarily know what's coming or where it's coming from. And so we've been out working with Maine manufacturers, and Maine manufacturers have been incredibly resilient at looking at what solutions can they create and pivoting some of their manufacturing really pretty quickly. Not all PPE is the same. I've learned more about personal protective equipment than I thought I would ever know. We don't have anybody that can make particular types of masks, the N95 mask, which is the top stock. But we do have a number of manufacturers that can make face shields. We do have a number of manufacturers that can make surgical masks. We just need to get them certified. We do have a number of manufacturers that are making face coverings. We have people that are making all kinds of other pieces as part of this supply chain. And so I think we may be in a position where we can create some of our own supply and serve a lot of our own need and be much more self-sufficient than maybe we were 3 months ago as it relates to this type of product. So Maine manufacturers have really done a good job in partnership with Maine MEP and university and some others in thinking about how do they retrofit some of this work and then get it out available in a tiered way so that healthcare workers and first responders get what they need first, but that consumers and businesses can start finding, face coverings and face coverings above that kind of low tier that you make at home, but that are manufactured with polypropylene and have particle separation. So, I do think some of this is how we solve our own challenges locally. We won't solve the N95 challenge locally because we don't have anybody that can make that. But outside of that, we do have some great manufacturers that are coming to the rescue as well.
That's great. Well, we're up against the clock. I want to thank Senator King and Commissioner Johnson for making time available. I know the demands on your time are great right now, and we appreciate you making time available for our local business leaders and members. I want to thank Eden Peabody again for sponsoring this, and the Maine State Chamber for helping us with the Zoom connection today. And I know there's a lot of questions that we didn't get to, and we knew that was going to be the case, but we'll do our best to loop back and try to provide answers to those questions. We'll be making this available as a recording too on our website so that you can see it later or share it with your friends. So thank you everybody for joining us, and wishing you all well. Have a great day.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.